Third part. So what are you gonna do? Dee's left hand asked with laughter in its voice as the hunter galloped for the edge of the village. Some want you to wake her up, and some don't. And both sides are pretty damn serious about it. Hell, both sides are trying to settle the battle themselves. To be destroyed or not be destroyed. You're the man of destiny for them. What kind of star were you born under? I'm leaving the village, Dee said as they tore through the blue darkness ahead of them. It's no use. This is a dream world. You can't leave unless the dreamer lets you. Take in the wind, the hunter said. His words were as hard as the slap of a gale. Almost immediately, his left hand went out by his side, as if to challenge the winds buffeting him, and his palm inhaled with an incredible whistling sound. We'll make it out at this rate, the hunter said, but it wasn't clear if the remark was directed at his left hand or himself. Dee's feet struck his mount's flanks, and the creature galloped on madly. Dee turned to the right suddenly and caught sight of a black shape, racing right with him along the fence. It was the Black Panther. The instant Dee saw Duncan sitting there on the beast, a flash flew from the hunter's right hand, and his rein sailed through the air. The rough wooden needle sank into Duncan with fierce accuracy, but a heartbeat later, the panther's charging body split into 3 parts, all of which leapt straight for Dee. As they came down at him, the fangs and claws grew like silver serpents. All of them were deflected with a beautiful ring, and as they hung in the air helpless and unprepared for another engagement, the hunter's weapon once again flashed out. This time, the 3 pieces were bisected by a horizontal slash. But by the time the bloody mist shot out, Dee had already galloped ahead another 40 feet. Behind him, the 4 legs and hind legs gave chase, though they were now reduced to mere chunks of flesh. The distance grew swiftly between him and the remnants. Ahead of him, a stand of high trees was visible. Dee was at the edge of the village. Perhaps he had a chance of escaping after all. His left hand reached out before him. A human face formed on its palm, and the lips on that face pursed. The wind howled. Before, it had inhaled, but now it exhaled. It wasn't clear exactly what kind of infernal manipulations his palm might have done to the air in the interim, but the scenery ahead of it began to quiver like mist. Like a thin sheet of paper shredding in the face of a hurricane, the fence and the forest beyond grew hazy. Behind them, another scene came into view, though there was no way to gauge the distance to it. A vague phantasmal grove of trees and a dawn sky. That had to be the real world out there. His horse picked up speed. Just before the fence, its 4 hooves left the ground in a mighty leap. Headlong, it rushed at a scene that was like a double exposure in some gorgeous, mesmerizing film. But the beast floundered in midair. Leaving his horse as it dropped like a stone, Dee sailed through the air, then came back to earth. His sword raced out, deflecting a knife flying at him. Just as I expected. When I go after you head-on, I ain't much of a threat. Dee threw his gaze in the direction of the voice, having determined that the knife had come from the huge form on horseback lurking behind the trees. It was none other than one of the infamous Bio brothers, Harold B. And that's exactly why I'm going to take you on from every which way. Look. With these words, Harold's body bent backward, and a false image pulled free from him. A wooden needle shot out, passing in vain through the original body, before embedding itself in a tree behind him. The false image grinned at the hunter. Another transparent image flew to the fore, but the one that had created it didn't fade. and the newer image also went on to create another false image, as did the one that made it, and the one after that. And in the space of a few seconds, the area around Dee was filled by countless images of Harold. That wouldn't have been a problem if it was clear which one of them was real, but there was no sign of the true Harold. Even Dee, with his incredibly acute senses, found all the false images to be exactly like the real thing. This time we'll be using these. Dozens of mounted Harold images declared in unison, showing the weapons they had in their right hands, rough wooden stakes. I hear these things work just dandy on Dampier's too, and just so you know, we're all real. If there's 100 of us, we'll drive 100 stakes into you. Except that we're gonna do it a little differently. Like this. Streaks of white light flew from the right hands of a few of them. As the whirling stakes rained down on him from horseback, Dee became a black wind and dashed into action. Perhaps the images of Harold in the foremost ring knew what they were doing, as they called it to attack in low voices, each with a stake in one hand. The question remained, what would happen when the lone beautiful figure collided with the countless black ones? If Harold's plan had a single miscalculation, it was from experience rather than lack of it, and from conjectures he'd made about Dee's speed and strength with a sword based on their previous battle. None of the wooden stakes the false images brought down met anything but air. Every time the black shape moved between them, like a mystic bird with the hem of his coat flashing out around him, countless Harold images were cut in half, merging with the air as they vanished. Less than 20 seconds later, Dee stood motionless and alone on the clear, moonlit ground. If you retreat now, then there was no point calling you at all, the hunter said in a low voice. There was no answer for him, only a cold wind blowing by. Dee's gaze dropped to the corpse of his horse lying there on the ground. A knife was sunk deep into its neck. Can we make it out without any acceleration? He asked. Not on your life, his left hand replied. At times like this, what you need is for someone to just plunk you down a brand new horse right here and now. You know, as far as dreams go, this one ain't very accommodating. Saying nothing, Dee shook the gore from his blade and returned it to the sheath on his back. It was a second later that he did an about-face, stopping an unseen attack with a metallic clang and a shower of sparks. The hunter's blade slashed into a certain spot in the sky with overwhelming power. The unmistakable sound of flesh being rent resounded. Groans of someone in their death throes rang out. And with these sounds, the badly battered form of Harold B. came into focus right in front of Dee. Don't be thinking you're safe now. This ain't your world. As Harold finally finished getting the words out, blood spilled from his mouth, and he fell flat on his face. The only reason he'd been able to wound Dee earlier was because the hunter had been distracted by the hospital director and his machine. That was a lot easier than expected. So what do we do now? Not even bothering to glance at Harold D., replied to his left hand's question. Nothing we can do but wait, even though the very shadows are our enemies here. Yeah? That's all well and good. But you can't just stand around in one spot either. Well, are you gonna get walking or what? Even before his hand finished speaking, Dee had already started walking toward the fence. It was only a little over 6 feet high, and it was 3 layers thick. Lightly kicking off the ground, Dee landed easily on the other side of the fence, but he didn't start walking right away. There was no road on the other side of the fence. There wasn't even a forest. The edge of the grove was off in the distance now, and before him the ground was cleared of trees, but well covered with gravestones, round ones and square ones, large and small. It was a cemetery. If this was to be the final battle, then this truly would be a fitting place for it. This place that nobles and humans had once shared as friends was now desolate and decaying, and a stifling miasma shrouded the area, despite the fact that it was now night. Dee advanced a step. He was in the center of the cemetery. Off to his left was a particularly large crypt made of marble. The domed roof was equipped with a parabolic antenna for an information satellite service and a laser detection system. It was also thoroughly covered with dust. A dark line ran right down the middle of the polished doors, as they swung open without a sound. Dee watched silently. What else could be coming out of the home of a noble, but one of the nobility? Undoubtedly this was a final assassin the world was sending after Dee, even after the form of Sheriff Krutz pushed its way out. Undoubtedly, this was a final assassin the world was sending after Dee. Even after the form of Sheriff Krutz pushed its way out of the darkness, Dee's expression never changed. The scrap of cloth left by the assassin that had targeted him earlier, in the dream, was a piece off the hem of the sheriff's coat. He'd been under their control for a while. The sheriff held a stake-firing gun. Below his vacant eyes, his lips rose and a pair of fangs peeked from his mouth. Apparently the world had given Sheriff Krutz exactly what he needed to fight Dee on equal terms. "Looks like we've finally come down to it," the sheriff muttered grimly as he stepped down to the ground from the crypt. "I'm not in control of myself anymore." 10 feet lay between the two of them. Dee would be a heartbeat too late to do anything about the stake gun. "I can't miss you with this gun, and I won't," the sheriff continued softly. "Even now, I'm not entirely sure whether I should be defending this world or not. But I can't help it. When you see Sybil in the hereafter, give her my apologies. And if she's one of the nobility, just how is she supposed to die?" Dee asked. His gaze and his tone were those of a vampire hunter. "Sybil will continue sleeping, and your wife will keep waiting for you to come back to her. It would seem the world you're trying to protect isn't all fun and games." Sheriff Krutz pulled the trigger. The pressurized gas cylinder inside the firing mechanism gave the 1-pound stake a speed of 2,300 feet per second. But it was struck down before Dee's chest by a silvery flash of light. As the saying went, Dee's sword could cut down a laser beam. A flash of white flew from Dee's left hand. The pale needle vanished in the darkness, and the sheriff's body leapt to an unbelievable height. With a whoosh, a couple of silver missiles launched from the tip of the sheriff's extended hand, spitting tiny flames from their tails as they flew at Dee down on the ground. Gathering up the hem of his coat, Dee pulled it to his chest and then flung it wide. His timing was exceptional, and the coat changed the direction of the missiles without striking their fuses, and the 3 harbingers of death, unable to assume a new course, turned the ground into a fiery patch of hell. In midair the 2 shadows passed, as the figures came back to earth, a few yards apart. One of them wobbled badly, and fell against the gravestone beside him. "If they change me again, will it change this me, Dee?" "I don't know," the hunter replied. "Either way, I don't want to get up again. Good luck to you." Braced against the gravestone, Kurt quickly grew weaker in his movements. As the sheriff slowed down the stone, a softly mumbled word could be heard. "That was a name, wasn't it?" Dee's left hand muttered. For once, his tone was incredibly serious. "So what did he say? Eiling or Sybil?" Dee didn't answer. The flames painted his face with ghastly shadows and colors. Even if there were others still who didn't want the girl to awaken and planned to continue to act on their beliefs, it was safe to say that here the curtain had fallen on at least one of their attacks on Dee. But what awaited him next? Dee was about to walk away when suddenly a presence stirred around him. Every single gravestone began to shake. Dee stopped. One of the gravestones fell over. The sound was heard time and again. Even when the first figure got up out of its grave, the sound of the falling monuments didn't stop. "Dee," Dr. Allen called out. "Dee," Mrs. Sheldon called out. "Dee," Eileen called out. The hotel manager politely asked him to stop. Clemens told him not to do it. Bates groaned at him not to let her wake up. Tokov was there too. All the villagers were there. Everyone was pleading with him. They told him not to let her waken. With pale hands outstretched, the herd closed in on Dee. The young man had never been one to show mercy to his foes. With a potent aura emanating from every inch of him, Dee readied himself to attack. The wave of humanity surrounded him like a tsunami, but at the very instant they were about to break, something split the air. Some didn't make a sound, others kneeled over screaming, but all of them had the ends of black iron arrows poking out of their chests or throats. In their final moments of life, those who didn't die instantly continued toward Dee, with vindictiveness fixed on their previously vacant and pallid faces. The steel arrows raining down dropped them one after another until finally the last of them fell. As Dee stood in a world strewn with corpses and choked with the stench of blood, he suddenly noticed a man and a woman standing at the edge of the cemetery. The archer in black and Sybil in white. The dream of the Sybil within the dream had finally become reality in this world. And it was probably only in a dream that a lone archer could drop hundreds of villagers. "We won't kill you," Sybil said, boundless hatred and grief hanging in her voice. "Because you are going to kill me." Her pale finger pointed at Dee. The man drew back on his bow. A steel arrow sliced through the wind. Dee saw that single arrow become multiple shafts in midair. The hem of his coat flew up to counter the attack. Deflected arrows sank into the ground, but still others pierced Dee's shoulders and abdomen. "How was that?" Sybil asked with a smile as Dee dropped to his knees in pain. Still not in the mood to kill me. And here I thought the one called Dee was supposed to deal death to all who challenged him. "I beg of you, kill me." Arrows jutted out all over Dee's body, but his expression was no different from usual. Tears glistened in Sybil's eyes at the hunter's stern refusal. The archer in black notched another arrow. Before he had finished, Dee raised his chest. "Don't," was all the hunter said. If the next shot went through his heart, the wound would be fatal. The bow released with a twang. At the same instant, a silvery gleam shot from Dee's hand. He threw in his longsword. Faster than the arrows, it pierced the heart of the man in black, and he fell to the ground with a force that knocked the scarf away from his mouth. As Sybil stood there stunned, unable even to speak, Dee staggered toward her. "You still want to die now?" he asked. "Yes," The girl replied joyfully, neither nervous nor distraught. You were one possibility, Dee said softly. The bright blood dripped from countless points on his body and stained the earth. A certain man chose you to entrust with his hopes. Here in your village, in your world, humans and nobles lived together in mutual understanding. And this was through your power. And it was a wonderful thing, but it truly pained me. Always sleeping, forever dreaming, and nothing else. Never knowing joy or sorrow or pain. Dee looked at the corpse in black by her side. The scarf had flown out of the way, and he could see the face clearly. It was Sheriff Crooks. Choosing the man she loved more than any other as her protector was probably a natural move on the part of her heart. The saddest melodies came to Dee's ears. The ground became a highly polished floor. He could tell without even looking at it the figures swirling around him were dancing a waltz. The ball was in full swing now. Dee. As Sybil called out his name, a certain emotion seemed to echo in it. In her pale hand a knife glittered coldly. Sybil advanced. Their bodies overlapped into a single form, as if pierced by pure delight. Sybil shut her eyes and shook with ecstasy. Her tears gleamed with blue, and then all movement stopped. After Dee pulled his blade from the sheriff's chest, he ran it through Sybil. The girl's knife was still tight in her right hand. The real question was whether Dee knew she'd never intended to stab him. The weight of her body against him suddenly vanished. He turned around. The dancers stood like phantoms, then vanished just the same. And Sybil's face was that of Nan. The girl who'd slept forever in this world must have transferred her consciousness to Nan so that she might live a life. Both Dee and Sheriff Crooks had probably known. After all, when the vision of Sybil had appeared before them for the first time, she was wearing the same clothes as the girl. Staggering, dragging one leg behind him, Dee went around behind the girl. He looked at the face of her partner. It was Sheriff Crooks, and it was Dee. It was both, and it was neither. The man she danced with for 3 decades under the blue light of the moon, and the man summoned to wake the slumbering princess. Dee's eyes dropped to the Sheriff Archer's face, pulling all the arrows from his own flesh and throwing them to the floor. The hunter headed for the door. Even as he pulled the arrows out and walked away, his expression remained immutable, just as it was when he stabbed Sybil. Nan was in her room, lying on her bed, when she realized the awakening had come. Old Mrs. Sheldon was out on her porch in her rocking chair. Eiling was staring up at the night sky. Dr. Allen was watching over Sybil as she faded from existence. All was still. It was a truly quiet night. Dee opened his eyes. The rays of dawn were bleaching the world. He was in the middle of the forest, considering the position of the sun and the time he'd gone to sleep. No more than 2 hours could have passed. Dee still remembered every detail of the strange dream. This was the same vacant lot where the mansion had been located. And then he noticed something. His position had changed. The tree he'd been resting against towered from a spot some 40 feet to his left. His sidewalk horse was over there too. "A hell of a dream that was," a mocking voice said, although it sounded somewhat weary too. The reason for this new location was immediately evident. A lone corpse lay at his feet, hidden in the high grass. It showed every sign of having been there for many long years. It must have been there at least 30 years, the voice said. There's a stab mark on the chest. Well, now we know. The real Sybil had been banished from the village and discarded in this forest. 30 years. Perhaps it was only natural that as she lay there all that time, lashed by rain, shivering in the wind, dreaming of a perfect community of humans and nobles, her heart had taken measures to find peace for her. Dee headed for his horse. He'd been summoned to a village, and had to be there by the end of the day. Loading his gear up behind his saddle, Dee was about to mount up when a spirited voice called out to him. Say you there, isn't there supposed to be a village around here? As the woman on the wagon gazed raptly at Dee, she added, I don't know, maybe it was just my imagination, but I had this dream about it last night, and it all seemed so real. Hey, what are you looking at? She asked the young man. Nothing, Dee replied, giving a slight shake of his head. Then I'll thank you kindly to spare me the funny looks. I may not seem like much, but everyone in these parts knows Maggie the Almighty. But you know what? The woman began, knitting her brow. Now that I think about it, haven't we met somewhere before? No. Never. No, I guess not. If I'd seen a looker like you before, I sure as heck wouldn't forget it. And yet, the woman started to say, looking astonished as she gazed at the young man on horseback. A rosy glow quickly suffused her face. In the end, she never actually knew that she was responsible for the smile etched on the lips of the young man in black as he rode off into the distance. But for a long time after that, her feelings of good fortune took the form of the young man who visited her dreams each night. Chapter 6, End. Vampire Hunter D, The Stuff of Dreams, Volume 5. Written by Hideyuki Kikuchi, illustrations by Yoshitaka Amano. End.